At this point, we're ready to make that stats area. Let's take a look at this. This is this area here. I've got a close-up here. So we're going to make this, and we're going to make the follow form right here. Because we plan to put those stats on both the profile page and the home page, we should put them in a partial. Should be in the shared directory. Let's go here. App views shared. Let's call it stats. Let's put it in a div with class stats. And now let's take a look at the mockup again. So this should be a link to the following, and this should be a link to the followers. We don't actually have those routes defined yet, so let's stub it out for now. And then inside this link, let's have the count, like this, and then a label. So let's put it in the strong tag with class following, actually ID following, and class stat. I actually don't know if this is going to work. Let's check it out. No, it didn't. So we can do this, and then class stat, and this should be the following count. So remember, we have this, say a current user dot following. Of course, this will only work for logged in users, and will only really apply to the home page and the user's own profile page. So we'll fix this up in just a moment, but let's start off with this. Current user dot following dot count. As with counting the microposts through the association, this is smart. Rails calculates this in the database and then returns the result. So it's very efficient. And we can say following. And then have the same sort of thing for the followers. So let's call this the followers ID. Also a stat class. And this should be followers. Let's render this on the home page to start off with. It's going to be after the user info, but before the micropost form. So let's do this section. Class stats. And we can render. Shared stats. And let's check it out. So we have to log in. Let's go to the home page. And there it is. It's not styled yet, but it's shown up. That's pretty cool. So let's put the CSS in. This is going to go in the sidebar CSS, which is right here. So let's just add it to the bottom of that, right before this forms part. And as I often have, I'm just going to copy this from the tutorial. Let's copy into the sidebars area. So it starts with this stats down to users.follow. Paste that in. Oops, I guess I missed that closing brace, didn't I? Yep. Okay. Let's take a look at this, refresh it. Nice. If I mouse over it, yeah, it changes color. That's great. Now let's put the stats on the user profile page. That's show. Same thing, we can render stats partial right here after the name. So this after this section. So let's go to the profile. And there it is again. But of course, this only works for this user. If we go to a different user, it's the stats for the current user. That's not what we want at all, though. So if we go here, what we want is to use the current user only if there's not already an @user. So remember, in the user's controller, there's this @user equals user.find of params of ID. So that comes out of here, this 5 here in the URL. But this page is currently using the current user that's logged in rather than user 5. So we want to use @user if it exists, otherwise use current user. So let's define @user. This is embedded Ruby, but we're not actually inserting this into the template, so we don't need an equal sign here. So this is going to be, the user is going to be, well, let's use @user if it exists, but if that isn't defined, then it'll be nil, and we can say or current user. This may look familiar. We saw this in the sessions helper. This here, @current user or equals user.findBy, is exactly the same kind of construction we have here. So this can be replaced with or equals current user, like that. And then instead of current user, we can say @user. Save that, and now it should change right here. There it is, one following, one followers. By the way, it's okay to have plural followers here, even though there's only one, because this is a label. Instead of saying one followers, this is saying followers 1. So that's why we didn't use the pluralize method in this case. Now that the stats are basically working, let's fill in these links here, these hrefs, to the following user path and the followers user path. So you might guess that involves editing the routes file. So what we'd like to do here is put in some embedded Ruby and say following user path of @user. And this should return something like /user/1/following. So this is going to be the page for the users being followed. Again, we can look at the mock-up here. That's over here. Here it should be, here's following. Yeah. So we want to link to this page, which means creating a route that has the user's ID in it. So we want it to be something like this. /users, let's go here. /user/1/following. Compare this to /user/1/edit. Right. So we want this to be following, and this will return the users that user 1 is following. And the way to do that is using what's called the member method. It works like this. Give a block to resources users, and then we can say member do, responding to get requests, get following, and followers. This is the kind of thing you can just read about if you go to Google and type something like Rails routing, or look at the footnote in the Rails tutorial. You'll see that this is how to make a URL of this form. Or rather, it's how to make a route that gives you that kind of URL. By the way, if you wanted something that didn't have the ID, if you just wanted /user/tigers, something like that, you would define it like this, with collection. But we don't need that, because there are no tigers here. Well, except in the mockups. So this gives us this following user path, and it also gives us a followers user path. We can paste that in here. And of course, we're going to have to define actions and views for these, but this will give us the route. Save that and take a look. Actually, save this here. Refresh it and see if we mouse over, what do we get? You can see here in the bottom left, /user/1/following, so it worked. If we go back to that other user, or another user, here's this one here, we've now got this stat partial working. All we need to complete our mockup is to put a follow form or an unfollow form. These forms will be creating and destroying relationships, but they're going to be accessed through the user's resource here, this user's controller. So it's convenient to define the forms themselves in the user's view directory. So that's an app views users. And we'll define them as partials and then render them on the user show page. So let's make a follow form here. Again, the leading underscore because it's a partial. And take a look at this. Actually, let's make the unfollow form too while we're at it. Now this is a little tricky. This is a form for creating a new relationship. So that means we need, in this follow form, a new active relationship object in memory. Remember from our table, we can get that using build here. So in this case, it's the current user. I'm going to do this. Form for current user dot active relationships dot build, and the followed ID will be the user on this page, so that's at user, that user's ID. So this is absolutely the kind of thing you might very well not have figured out. Might take some experimentation to get it working. In fact, there's a mistake here. There we go. But you can work an analogy with things like the sign-up form. Here we have form for at user, and this at user is from the user's controller. It's right here. So this is the equivalent of saying current user.activerelationships.new, except in this case it's build, and then we have to give it the followed ID in order to make the association. And then an analogy with this here, there's going to be a form variable, do f. Let's take a look at the mockup. So there's just a submit button. There's no other text. Go here. We can say f.submit follow, and then give it the classes that we use to style it. And these are from Bootstrap. So now think about what this is going to do in terms of the routing. This here, this form for a new user, is routed via the routes here to the user's resource. In particular, it gets routed because of resources users to the create action here because it's a post request. So this here is going to issue a post request not to the user's controller, but because this is a relationship, to the relationships controller. That controller doesn't exist yet. We're about to create it, but we can make the route right now. We can add the resource for relationships right here. And we're only going to be creating and destroying them. But I also noticed that there's some cruft here, some extra stuff that came from generating things. We don't need any of those. Let's save that. And this will now give us the route that will respond to this request. This will be clear once we render this on a page. In fact, let's see how that works. Let's make a follow form for users. So this is going to be either the follow form or the unfollow form, depending on whether the user is following the other user. So if, we'll use our following question mark helper, if the current user is following the user whose profile this is, so that's at user, that's if this is true, then we should render the unfollow form. This is render unfollow, else render the follow form. And then we can go to the show page, and inside here, let's render it right above the microposts. So render follow form. Save this and save this. And let's find a user that's not being followed. So actually, this user isn't being followed, so it should work. There we go. There's the follow form at the top. And you can see that the action is /relationships, and that route here that we just made, that'll be routed to the create action in the relationships controller, which we'll generate in a moment. Let's take a look at our tests. You can see we've got an error here. Undefined method following question mark for nil class. So where is that coming from? It's coming from here. So this nil class means that current user is nil. And that's true. If we look here in the follow form, there has to be a current user. But of course, this doesn't exist if the user isn't logged in. So we should only render this follow form if the user is logged in. Go here, if logged in. You can see our tests are useful, even though we haven't actually specifically tested that. Still caught something. That's good. There's something else weird going on. If we look at this follow form, think about what's happening if we submit this. In the create action for the relationship, we're going to have to find the followed user, just like we did here in the create action. There's going to be strong parameters. Here it was name, email, password, password confirmation. We're going to have something similar in the relationships controller, but right now there's no way to transmit that information from the form. This object knows the followed ID, but there's no way that that can propagate all the way to the controller. So what we have to do is the same thing that we did in lesson 10, where we had an email on the password resets form. So let's see where that was. That was here. We needed a hidden tag. So we can do the same thing here. Let's put it in a div. Say div hidden field tag. Followed ID, and just @user ID. And you know what I've realized is we don't actually need this. We do not need the followed ID here. We actually don't need that ID just to create this thing in memory. We never actually use that information when making the form. Okay, so now this is the exact analog of doing this here. User.new. Now it's current user.activerelationships.build. So remember, build is basically the same as new. And then we've got this hidden field that will propagate the user to be followed, and then we can pull it out with params of followed ID. Let's make the unfollow form now. Just copy this. It's going to be quite similar. Now what we're going to do is find the relationship between these users using current user.activerelationships.findBy at user.id. Oh, and that's the followed ID. And then this is to destroy the relationship, so we need to tell it its method delete. The way to do that is like this. It's part of the HTML, so we need to give it HTML as the key, and then the value is the hash method delete. You've seen that before. It's right here in the micropost form. So here we've got HTML multipart true, and now we're doing HTML method delete. So we've also seen method delete. a couple times. Right, so we've got this link to here, for example. In this case, we don't need the followed ID in the hidden field because this here, this form, this is for a relationship that already exists. But I think we need to know closing paren here. Yeah. So when we submit this form, it will go to the destroy action of the relationships controller, and this here will give us the ID of the relationship, which we can then find in the database and destroy. So we don't need this here. This should be unfollow. And let's take a look at it. There's one more change we're going to make. Let's look at a user that's being followed. I think user 5 was being followed. Yeah. Well, for one, I should change this from unallow to unfollow. But here you can see that the color is the same. And it's actually nice. We can just get rid of this button primary. I'll make it gray instead of blue. There we go. So if we look at this form, you can see there's a form for editing a relationship. And the reason that Rails knows to do that is because this relationship already exists. Remember, we saw this back with this edit form for users. Here's the method is delete. That's from this here. And it has the ID, action equals slash relationship slash 3. So this is the ID that identifies the relationship between the current user that's logged in and user 5. This will become clearer in a couple sections when we actually get these forms working. But for now, the front end is working. We've got these stats here on the home page, the profile page, on the users page. There's just one more thing. You might have noticed it actually just now. On the user's own profile page, there's no reason to have this follow button. So we should add something in there. In the follow form, we can say unless current user !@user. So what happened here is the current user is the same as user 1. This is what gives rise to @user. This is in here. User.find of params of ID, which is 1 in this case. But that's also current user. So we should say unless current user !@user using our current user Boolean, then render the follow form. Save that. And there we go. So this is a pretty typical sequence. We've made some sample data, we've built the front end, and now we need to make the back end. So that means getting the following and followers pages to work and getting these forms to work, these follow and unfollow forms.